Va bene. Va bene, guardiamo un attimo una decina di minuti i regolamenti per l'AI. Okay, so these data actually probably are even a bit old, probably 12 months. We have one more than 1,000 medical devices that include artificial intelligence approved in the US for use in the clinical device in the clinical field. Now, first of all, what's a medical device? That's a legal definition. By the way, I got this material from US regulations because they were easier to get, and I don't know if that's still the same with all the changes in the FDA, but they are not as easy to find as you would expect anyway for both polls, whether the US or EU. Anyway, the concept is similar, and given up my lack of experience in laws, that's not the biggest bottleneck. Anyway, a medical device, by legal definition, is any instrument, apparatus, appliance, software, implant, reagent, material, or other article intended to be used for by whoever manufactures that, to be used for some specific medical purposes. So the first part means it can really be whatever. And indeed, we are talking from the Apple Watch that does ECG, which is categorized as a medical device, to crutches, to walk, to wheelchairs, to syringe, to glasses, to some topical creams. For some reason, that some of them are categorized as devices and not as drugs. And so it's a very wide-ranging definition. Of course, it's actual electronic devices like a pacemaker and so on. And the purposes might include diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, treatment, alleviation of disease or injuries, and compensation for disabilities. As I said, a prosthesis, a bed for a bedridden patient that prevents plagues, or glasses, or the ECG, and so on. They can also be used for investigating, replacing, modifying anatomy, and so on. In all of that, is machine learning a medical device? That's the question for now. Nowadays, there is the category of software as a medical device. So software as an ensemble of code that you might download from the internet, because it's not even anymore a CD that you buy. And however, you can also have many physical devices that include AI within that. Like you buy a CT scanner, and the image denoising algorithms that they sell you with that is based on AI. The automatic bed placement is based on AI, and so on. Now, what are the categories for medical devices? There are 3 categories in the US, and we are very similar to that. Category 1 is minimal potential for harm. Category 3 is devices that support life, are implanted, or present unreasonable risk of illness of injuries. Like if you get an implanted pacemaker, or if you have an extra body oxygenation machine to keep the blood flowing when your heart is stopped during an operation. That's a life support machine, which is considered extremely critical. And then we have category 2, which is everything else. And most of the devices will be of these categories, actually. I don't know, probably glasses are category 1, and I don't even know if crutches are category 1, because if the crutches fail while you're walking and you fall down, it's not minimal. How does the marketing approval work? And in class 1, you need to demonstrate that you are adhering to some industry standard, good manufacturing practice. That's everything you need to do. You're manufacturing glasses, you need to probably just show that you are doing that with according to some ISO norm or some other state of the art of the industry. In class 3, you have to do a pre-market approval, which has an explicit investigation of safety and effectiveness of that specific model. And for class 2, it's somewhere in the middle. The performance standards are reviewed and see what you can, how does your device classifies as compared to the standards. And in most cases, what they work with is the pre-market notification clearance, 510K. The Americans like to use this kind of codes. And you need to demonstrate that the device is substantially equivalent, that's the legal term, to an existing one that's already legally on the market. And the marketing can be very expedited if the testing and safety and effectiveness are performed according to the consensus standard. The issues that is that the last time that I updated these slides, there was 1,500 consensus standards. And if you want, there's an interesting historical overview of how the approval of devices went from when the legislation was invented in 1976 until 2020. But there are also some de novo options. And for what concerns us, let's focus on the approved AI-based devices. Here are the links to the FDA website with the updated, like once a year, list of all approved AI-based medical devices. And here is the last time that I updated that some the classification by the code, because every product class is classified according to a code. And indeed, the most frequency was LLZ, which is Medical Image Management and Processing System. These are maybe radiology reading workstations. Also, the second one was automated image processing software. Then you have CT scanners, and here you have computer-assisted triage, which again, but mostly was done on images and ultrasound. So you can see that images play a really big part of them. Last year, finally, we had a white paper produced by the working group of the Food and Drug Administration about how they are doing that, because everything that I've told you until now is very generic, extremely generic. And it was quite hard for us outside of the FDA to know what else they were doing. And indeed, they finally published a white paper, and which where, by the way, they explicitly state that this is a field in active development. So the guidelines are shifting year by year. And what happens is that they first thing determine the regulatory pathway, the one that I told you, and whether you are doing a substantial equivalent test, or determining the product class. Because if you say this is a image processing software and they say this is not, this is a CT scanner or something like that, they might want to, the reviewers might want to apply different standards. According to that, they determine which controls to apply, and then they develop a submission content and testing, so what they want to see. We will analyze all of these factors, and the most one of the most relevant ones is the indication for use. Then if you have used the machine learning models, you need to describe that, which data that you used, some non-clinical tests, some clinical tests, and everything else that might be relevant. Now, let's start for the indications for use. They are mandatory for any drug or medical device. Like when you buy an aspirin, there's written a list of what you can use it for, and if you want to use it for another thing, that's really not approved. And for some drugs, you can use it for, and if you want to use it for another thing, that's really not approved. And for some drugs, you can do that if the physician sign off, but that's a so-called off-label use with lots of legal issues, and it's mandatory for the user to follow these rules. Like this is a software to analyze bone marrow in CT, and these are the indications for use. Says an automatic image processing software utilizing deep learning to facilitate visualization of bone marrow. And it can be used, the output, during the review of traumatic and non-traumatic bone pathologies. So if it said you can use it to review traumatic bone pathologies, and the physician said, come on, it works anyway on integer bones, actually, the reading that the physician signs after that would carry lots of more legal responsibility, because if a patient sues, and patients do sue quite often, I mean, a typical radiologist might sign off 20 readings per day, which in a working year is 4,000 reviews. And so it's very easy to get one wrong, and relatively easy to get sued once every 2 years or 5 years or so. And so if you prove that you followed all of the best practice, it's okay. If you didn't, even if you might have been in the right, it's much more easy. Your position is much more difficult. And by the way, there was a newspaper article in 2020, I guess, saying that radiology will disappear given AI, because AI was performing better than radiologists. And in some cases, it actually is like that. But what happened is that in the US, they can't hire enough radiologists. There is a super increase in demand because AI increased the requests for radiology examination. And also, legally, you need one to sign off. We might not think of that as IT scientists or so on, but when I'm talking about when I was working in a hospital and I was talking with physicians and said, you can do that, the question would be, who signs that? I said, someone will figure it out. But for the physician who risks going to jail or getting into a $1 million case, that's really an important task. So second thing that the FDA wants to see when you're doing something that includes AI in the device, they want you to describe the architecture, including some flowchart references, so that they can understand the complexity and generalizability, probably in a qualitative way anyway. Inputs, specifying the data dimension of each input, which metadata are important. If they use engineered features and have been selected, how this has been done. The pre-processing and post-processing necessary, as I've shown you in my example where I was getting the brain age prediction wrong just to a single flag in all the pipeline. It's important to know all of these. It's trick of the implementation. It's not theory of the algorithm, but it's really important. And sometimes there are checks on the output. It's very often, or cleaning. You get a segmentation model, and maybe you add a routine that removes masks under a certain dimension because you know they're unfeasible. You need to describe that. The network that you used and how it was developed. So the training and tuning process, whether you use transfer learning, whether you use augmentation, regularization, ensemble, and if you did an hyperparameter search, how you did it, and all of the metrics that you use to assess performances and so on. Indeed, as we've discussed a lot, data are kings. So the number of subjects that you use, also remembering the issue of diminishing returns. So when you go from 100 patients to 1,000 patients, you get lots of improved model. When you go from 1,000 to 3,000, probably not that much anymore. And you need to say where they come from, private data, public collection, synthetic data, and so on. They want you to describe in details the demographics, class balance. If you're using CT scans because you want to train some denoising, the reason for which they were scanned. These, if you think about the bias theorem, that's the a priori probability for the class, for the distribution. Preparation, which kind of scanners were used, and so on, whether your test data set was large enough and whether the test data set was truly independent. Non-clinical testing, what they want you to do some, I don't know if you did these aspects in some IT courses, they want to know if the code review was performed, how the software as a whole was validated, if the human error analysis was performed, how it's robust to wrong user use, the error handling, and so on, and the standalone performance of the software, meaning which is a separated issue from the human software pair performance. So it's like the dice score of a model versus how well it works in the whole clinical pipeline. And because what they want you to do is, okay, when you want to evaluate the model, you have some metric dependent on the clinical endpoint. So what do you want to exactly get? Segmentation, prioritization of subjects, whether you want to do some binary classification, multi-class classification, 80% accuracy is a very vague term if you don't talk about which task you have to do. And indeed, they want to know if the metrics are depends on the prevalence of the disease, which are the indications for use. And then, of course, you want to know the performance, whether they depend on all possible confounding factors that comes to mind. So the acquisition center, race, device, sex, age, comorbidities, and so on. And finally, they want to perform some repeated studies using multiple readers also because you want to take into account the fact that there is a human using this software and there is a so-called end-to-end pipeline, which goes from the doctor that asks for the exam to the person doing the, I don't know the English term, probably the welcome in the hospital and enters all the data in the system because it's manually entered. Then to the technologists doing the acquisitions, the people who calibrated the machine, and the physician doing the reading while being informed by the output. And there have been found cases where sometimes the output was better when the performances was better than either software alone or human alone, but even cases where humans just approve the output of the software. So it's quite complex, and the interaction sometimes is more relevant than the independent factors. So you can see this, if you go on the AI on the FDA website that I mentioned, you can find lots of exemplary tools, not lots, all of the tools that are present, and you can click on them and see and read what's actually in a validation letter. Like if we read one, that was my last slide. Let me share again. Like if you open one of the software, you see the letter of approval by the FDA, and it's lots of legal terms, and then you can see what I have told you. So in this case, this one, they were doing a 510K approval, so they were trying to demonstrate substantial equivalence. Now, substantial equivalence does not mean that it has the same performance of another software. It means that it works kind of the same way, and hopefully it's better, but it's not something about the actual metrics. That you have the indication for use, like they say, this one is an image processing software intended for use by radiologists and nuclear medicine physicians for transfer, storage, and noise reduction of what these two PET. Remember that in PET you have an acquisition depends on the drug that you injected, and you visualize where the drug went. And they said we validated that exclusively for two kinds of tracer, and the image changes completely. So it makes sense that they work. They haven't been validated like these two. This works for whole body. This works in brain, and they might not work for neuroendocrine tumors in the abdomen studied with dopamine receptors, because they have a super high contrast of only one organ, and so it's totally different image. And then you have all the legal things, and here they say what they are testing against, which is, by the way, a specific object, a specific device with a specific version. Even software updates are pretty hard to validate and so on. Then you have the description. They say they tell you that they're using a convolutional neural networks. They tell you that they use the residual learning approach, and so on. The indications for use is the same. Well, they tell you that that you can work both on hybrid PET-CT and hybrid PET-MR. And here you can see that the comparison that they make. They say physical characteristics. One is a software package that operates on a computer that you buy yourself, and the other, well, this one operated on a virtual machine. That one's operated on a PC. This one is PC compatible. This one is uses a virtual machine. This works on site on the machine. This one works on the cloud. They both process DICOM data. Modalities, this one is specific for these modalities. And here, the software that they choose to validate against, that is something where you might have some kind of leeway. You can choose what you want to compare against. Here it was using some kind of feature engineered denoising algorithm. This device is using a neural network. And they tell you that the acquisition remains the same. And then they tell you which non-clinical test they did. And then they tell you that on some bench test cases, that they work showing increasing quantitative metrics for the cases. Now, these ones that they publish on the internet are summaries of the approval, and they just tell you what they developed against. They are not the whole package. Sadly, this is a commercial proprietary information, so we don't get to see them. But if you are curious about some software, you can click on the links that I put in the file and see what kind of device they've been invented. As I told you, nowadays we have really everything from patient positioning to image reconstruction software. So like at the core of the CT scanner, of the PET scanner, or even to MRI, it was one of the first one approved, where they get some maps of the blood flow direction and speed in the heart. So they are really relevant, but remember that for clinical application, the regulatory part is really, really much, and therefore the robustness is really much more important than getting an extra percentage point on the accuracy metrics. Okay, so any questions about all of these?